welcome to Levels Baptist Church Sunday night Bible study in the book of Jonah. And actually, before we get to the rest of verse 4, I want to go to Psalms and read from Psalms 48. And hopefully I'll be able to tie this in and you'll figure out what's going on and why we're doing this. We had started verse 4 and covered maybe the first half, but go to Psalms chapter 48, and I want to read verses 6 and 7. Fear took hold upon them there, and pain as of a woman in travail. Thou breakest the ships of Tarshish with an east wind. Now Jonah chapter 1 verse 4, but the Lord sent out a great wind into the sea, and there was a mighty tempest in the sea, so that the ship was like to be broken. If you did a word-for-word translation from Hebrew to English, it might say, and the ship thought it should be broken. Now that's interesting. Ships don't actually think, right? What is happening is you're getting this extremely vivid picture. You're animating the ship. The words are giving the ship the ability to think, to analyze the situation, to think through it, and to come up with a feeling based on this tempest. The ship is able to sense danger because of the tempest. It's being blown around. It's getting beat up by the waves. It's being terrified by the winds, to the point that the ship thought, this is just interesting how this is worded in the original Hebrew, it thought it was going to break apart. So the ship is given this ability to think, this animation, as if the ship was thinking something and we're being allowed the opportunity to peer into the mind of the ship. It's just really interesting how this is worded here. The ship considers itself, considers the power of the tempest that God had hurled at the ship, at the sea, and it comes to the conclusion that when you compare the ship, and this is the ship thinking, this is just so interesting the way this is worded. The ship compares itself in its own strength and its own capabilities, and it compares that with the strength and the power of the tempest, and it comes to the realization that it being the ship is not capable, it's not strong enough on its own to make it through this tempest. It's really beautiful. Just let me get through this before you start calling me some kind of kook. The Hebrew text in the original Hebrew text, the words that are translated broken up are used in a way to give the ship its own person, its own personality. Again, it's like it's animating the ship. These words are animating the ship, and it's giving the ship the opportunity to analyze the situation, the surroundings, to understand its job, its purpose of protecting the sailors. It is giving the ship feelings. It has hopes. It has fears. But it comes to the realization that it will end in destruction. We have this same word in Jeremiah. So I want to read Jeremiah 14:17. The same Hebrew word translated broken up. Jeremiah 14:17. Therefore thou shalt say this word unto them, let mine eyes run down with tears night and day, let them not cease, for the virgin daughter of my people is broken with a great breach, with a very grievous blow. So the ship is supposed to be providing a place of security in the chaos of the sea, and yet it's giving these words in the original Hebrew language are giving the ship a personality, an ability, a mind, an ability to think and to look at the situation and to come up with an outcome of what could possibly happen, and an understanding of its own possible failure, its own possible weakness, and the fact that it could indeed be overwhelmed, that it may not be able to handle the job of security. The sailors, it's interesting when we look at them, they probably gave it a few moments of thinking, okay, there's something we can do. We'll get to all that. You know, we have certain abilities, but it doesn't take them long before they begin to cry out, before they come to the realization they don't have enough ability within themselves to pull this ship through this storm. Well, it's interesting how the New Testament has stories that are so very similar to this. If you look in Acts 27, well, we don't have to turn right now, we'll turn in a minute, but a very, very similar situation. Paul in Acts 27, this powerful tempest, it's coming against the ship. They actually use cables to attempt to undergird the ship to keep it from breaking apart. Well, it doesn't work. The ship does wind up breaking into pieces. Now, they did all survive. Everybody lived. Jonah is on a ship. It's heading to Tarshish. Wind that's been hurled, a tempest hurled by God, has come against the ship. And just as I had read from those verses from Psalm a while ago, the winds come against the ships of Tarshish. I think the Bible many times asks the reader to make connections from one book to another to help generate a bigger picture so that you and I can have a greater understanding of everything that's going on. That psalm, those couple of verses that we read, speaks of the glory of God in Zion. It says, according to God's name, so is his praise, even to the ends of the earth. How can God's name be praised unto the ends of the earth? How can they know unless the word of God is preached? There has to be someone sharing. How can God's name be praised unto the ends of the earth unless his people proclaim it? Well, Jesus said that in that scenario, the rocks will cry out. So God's name is going to be praised one way or the other. Jonah has been asked to fill that role of that one that would go and preach, to share God's word. What does he do? He goes in the opposite directions. And so God answers his rebelliousness with a tempest. He hurls this tempest out onto the sea to come up against this ship. And it is feeling its weaknesses at this moment. The sailors are feeling their weaknesses at this moment. Those men, those sailors, I am quite sure, were terrified in that moment. I think they do understand. I think they make a connection between the storm and a greater, higher power. They don't maybe necessarily know who it is. I believe they understand that there is something else at work. Go back to Psalm, this time Psalm 107. I want to read 23, 24, and 25. Psalm 107, 23. They that go down to the sea in ships, that do business in great waters, these see the works of the Lord, and his wonders in the deep. For he commandeth, and raiseth the stormy wind, which lifteth up the waves thereof. So we're studying Jonah, and we're seeing what he's done in response to the command of God. He flees in the opposite direction. You can't help but think of Matthew chapter 8. Again, another very similar situation. God's earthly ministry. Let's read a few verses from the account in Matthew chapter 8, starting in verse 23. Matthew 8, 23 to 27. Before I read this, I guess you might call this bragging just a little bit, but I wanted to point out the fact that these very same verses were read by a volunteer while I was in a boat on the Sea of Galilee back earlier this year, back in February. Matthew chapter 8, starting in verse 23. And when he was entered into a ship, his disciples followed him, and behold, there arose a great tempest in the sea, insomuch that the ship was covered with the waves, but he was asleep. And his disciples came to him and awoke him, saying, Lord, save us, we perish. And he saith unto them, Why are ye fearful, O ye of little faith? Then he arose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. But the men marveled, saying, What manner of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him? What a question. So now we're back to Jonah. God is influencing his life. He's come to Jonah. He's given him a word, a command. Jonah flees in the opposite direction. God responds to the rebelliousness with a tempest. He comes against the ship with a great wind. In the case of Jesus and the disciples in Matthew chapter 8, he wants them to direct their eyes, their attention, their understanding. He doesn't want them looking at the wind or the tempest or the possible destruction. He wants them to see him, the one that is in charge, the one that can speak to and command the winds. So, I always think of living life as a Christian, and really I think it's true for anybody, whether you're saved or not, but it's almost as if God has some guardrails, like on the interstate, when maybe you're coming up to a bridge or just a place with a steep shoulder of some sort, maybe some woods, and the highway department, they've given you this X number of feet worth of road, 14, 28 feet, whatever it is, and then another 3 to 6 feet of edging there, and then you've got this guardrail, and you can swerve all you want all over that pavement back and forth, and of course you might get a ticket, so I'm not suggesting you do that, but you can do that and just waste a bunch of time and gas. But at a certain point in time, when you go too far either right or left, you're going to bang up against that guardrail. You're not going to be allowed to go off into those woods. Hopefully, that's what they're there for. I almost kind of feel like God has given us guardrails where He'll let you kind of meander and flail around a little bit and go so far, but at a certain point in time, there's going to be a tempest. A certain point in time, God's will be done. Now, don't get too proud when I say that and build yourself up and think, well, I must be really, really special and important. I must be the only one going on this road in this direction to go do this one thing. Oh, no. If it didn't work out with Jonah, he had somebody else that he could have got to go to Nineveh in Jonah's place. But Jonah worked out. So you and I should always be aware of those guardrails, of those opportunities for God to intercede in our lives. And I'm not saying that in a way that I'm influencing you to rush over there and bang up against it, because that's when life is the most uncomfortable. But I think it's helpful in some ways to know, maybe like a child and a teddy bear, or a child and a favorite little blanket of some sort, that comfort of knowing that God is there with us, walking through life with us. And He doesn't send the tempest to destroy us. He sends a tempest to kind of guide us and get us going in the right direction where we need to go. So what does Jonah do? Is he going to respond the right way? That's the question. When the tempest arises in your life, how are you going to respond? Of course, if you know the story of Jonah, you know what happens. And it's kind of a mixed bag as to whether he, I don't know how much he obeyed voluntarily. The whale spit him up anyway. Let's move on to verse number 5. In Jonah. So I got to get to the right book because I'm not even in Jonah. Jonah chapter 1 verse 5. Then the mariners were afraid, and cried every man unto his God, and cast forth the wares that were in the ship into the sea, to lighten it of them. But Jonah was going down into the sides of the ship, and he lay and was fast asleep. So you've got some sailors, they're afraid. They understand very quickly that this particular storm is pushing the limits of safety beyond what they are able to handle as far as their own skills and abilities. I have no doubt they were experienced, they were knowledgeable, they understood their jobs and their duties and what it is that they were there to do and how to do it. And they also understood that they had limitations, and they had come to the point that no matter what they did, this storm was serious, and it was more than they could handle. And they were in fear. So back to Paul in Acts. Let's read a couple verses and see. It's just amazing, this parallel. Look at Acts chapter 27. Starting in verse 21. Acts 27, 21. But after long abstinence, Paul stood forth in the midst of them and said, Sirs, ye should have hearkened unto me, and not have loosed from Crete, and to have gained this harm and loss. And now I exhort you to be of good cheer, for there shall be no loss of any man's life among you, but of the ship. For there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am, and whom I serve, saying, Fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar. And lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer. For I believe God that it shall be even as it was told me, howbeit we must be cast upon a certain island. So back to Jonah, verse 5. Then the mariners were afraid and cried every man unto his God. The Hebrew word translated cry comes from a primitive root. It actually means to shriek. This is someone in anguish. This is someone that recognizes severe danger. It's perceived, and this is not just a whimpering or a boo-hoo crying. They are in fear. They are upset. And so they cry out to their gods. Very interesting. Well, I think the plural here makes sense. Sailors could be from anywhere. They weren't necessarily all from the same town. They didn't all necessarily have the same God. They could have been from all different nations. They could have had all kinds of different gods here. So there's not a problem with this being plural. They could have all had the same false god, whoever it was, but they most likely were this just hodgepodge, just all these different sailors from all different places all around the world, all of them having different gods, and each one worshiped his own God in his own way, and they cried out to their own gods. Again, they recognized the severity, the seriousness of this storm, that it was being brought upon them by some greater, higher power, and they were crying out in response to that. Now, obviously, they had no idea who Jonah was, or that Jonah was in rebelliousness, that he was running away from a command that had been given him by God. So they're crying out to their gods, whoever their gods were. Well, it didn't work. It didn't do any good. Their gods weren't real, whoever their gods were. We know that there's only one true God, one living God that answers prayer, and his answers are based on his will, his wisdom, his purposes. You may remember Elijah on Mount Carmel in 1 Kings 18. We don't have to turn and read that, but an amazing picture of a group of false prophets crying out to a false god, and absolutely nothing happened. And then Elijah cries out to the one true living God, and oh boy, did something happen, right? Well, I'm not sure the state of mind of the sailors other than the state of fear and their understanding that they needed to cry out for somebody else to help them, some greater, higher power. Beyond that, I don't know too much else about how they were feeling other than just afraid. But it seems as if they understood this was beyond them. They needed a higher power to step in to help them, to assist them. So verse 5 goes on. It says, Then the mariners were afraid. They cried every man unto his God, cast forth the wares that were in the ship into the sea to lighten it of them. This is that second time that word hurled is used, where God hurled the tempest out onto the sea to come against that ship. Here these guys are hurling those boxes or crates or whatever it was, their wares. Now they're hurling them off the ship. They're trying to make the ship lighter. Part of the understanding of being a sailor was that the ship was safer the lighter it was. Okay, so be it. I don't know. I've never been a sailor. But that was standard practice, and we see that again in Acts. They did the same thing with Paul. So they cried out to their gods. Their gods seemed to pay them no attention. There's another psalm that I want to read. and it has to do with the nature of God, and it's giving us a contrast to other false gods. So look in Psalm 115, and we're going to read verses 3 through 8. Psalm 115, 3 through 8 says, "But our God is in the heavens. He hath done whatsoever he pleased. Their idols are silver and gold, the work of men's hands. They have mouths, but they speak not. Eyes have they, but they see not. They have ears, but they hear not. Noses have they, but they smell not. They have hands, but they handle not. Feet have they, but they walk not. Neither speak they through their throat. They that make them are like unto them. So is every one that trusteth in them." It's amazing what people will turn to sometimes in moments of fear, but it doesn't even have to be in a moment of fear. The point of what I'm saying now is just the fact that people will turn to the craziest things. And the Psalms we just read was talking about these man-made objects, these idols, where some craftsman takes some gold or silver or some kind of metal and he creates something, and he shapes it into, whether it was a man or some kind of a beast, something with a face and eyes and ears and mouth, but yet it's blind, deaf, and dumb. It can't do anything. It can't breathe, walk, or talk, or use its hands. And yet people will put these things up on the shelf and they'll look to it for help in times of struggle and trial and grief and distress and whatever else. These things that are made with human hands, these things that are worthless to help you in a time of grief, trial, and struggle. But people turn to these things all the time rather than turning to the one true living God, the one that does see and hear and talk. So the sailors, they understand their plight. They cry out. Nothing happens. They start throwing everything overboard to make the ship lighter. I mentioned this is the same word, hurled, where God hurled the tempest into the sea after the ship. But what you get, though, when you're using that same verb there, is you get the picture of God hurling something and who God is and what His capabilities are. That's in verse 4. But here now in verse 5, it is man with his power, his strength, his might, hurling something. So you see the contrast here between what God can do when He hurls something and the outcome versus man and what it is that we can do just simply with our own power and might and strength, which is typically, it means falling short. But these guys this is their livelihood. This is their job, to move these objects from one port to another, and they're throwing them overboard. That also tells you how much fear they were facing at that time. But again, there's parallelism. God hurling, man hurling. God's hand hurls the wind that is sent to correct, to guide, to bring about His will, versus the contrast. You've got man who is attempting to hurl the wares overboard. But again, the idea, the picture here is, what work can God achieve? What can He bring about when He hurls something with His hand, versus what can man bring about or achieve? What's the final ends when it comes to you and I using our strength, our works, our might to deliver ourselves? Well, the sailors found out that their gods failed them, and they turned to themselves, to their own strength, their own power, their own ability. They were in fear. They cried out to their gods, whoever their gods were, And when they didn't feel like they got an answer, especially not fast enough, they just said, oh, well, I just have to earn my own salvation. I have to work for it. I have to do it with my own hands. The word that's translated lighten is found 3 times in 2 Chronicles chapter 10. The people of Israel had come to Rehoboam, who was Solomon's son, and they asked for relief from the heavy load of taxes. We're not going to turn and read that. We're not going to make time for that. But it's the same understanding. Something is heavy. We need to make it lighter. So we need to unburden ourselves. We need to cast something off. We need to lighten our load. Couple of interesting verses in Matthew. Let's turn and read that real quick here. Matthew chapter 11. All this works together. Matthew 11, verses 28, 29, and 30. Come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and ye shall find rest unto your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. We've got these sailors frantically attempting with their own power, their own might, their own hands, attempting to bring about their own salvation. I can only imagine the weight of those objects. And I mean, the Bible points out this picture of something heavy having to be moved, and contrast that with the words of Jesus saying, take on my burden. Instead of trying to supply your own salvation and move that heavy load with your own hands, take on my burden, Jesus says. Well, they've got to meet the one true living God to get that message, to understand that their burden could be light. But nonetheless, until then, they got to deal with a tempest. It's got them scared to death. They're upset. It's wreaking havoc upon their lives in this moment. And it's not going away because of the work they're doing with their own hands, with their own power, with their own might. It's going to keep coming. And these parallels are just amazing to see how we've got this in Jonah, and we've got similar things happening throughout the New Testament, as we mentioned with Paul. And we're going to turn again and look at a couple more verses. The very same way these sailors in Jonah are trying to lighten the ship, lighten their load by casting things overboard. Look in Acts 27. Acts 27, starting in verse 14. But not long after there arose against it a tempestuous wind called Euroclydon. And when the ship was caught and could not bear up into the wind, we let her drive, and running under a certain island which is called Clauda, we had much work to come by the boat, which when they had taken up, they used helps, undergirding the ship. I just mentioned this to you a while ago. They tried to run some wires or cables around the ship to keep it together, and fearing lest they should fall into the quicksand, straight sail, and so were driven. And we, being exceedingly tossed with a tempest, the next day they lightened the ship. Verse 19, and the third day we cast out with our own hands the tackling of the ship. Later on, after that scene from those verses that we just read, they continue to throw precious cargo overboard, which the next thing that goes is wheat. Wheat, that's pretty important. They were so desperate, and they were so tied up in this idea of I'm going to save myself by throwing my food overboard. You know the expression of cutting off your nose to spite your face? How did they ever think that they were going to save their own lives by throwing their food overboard? Anyway, that's another sermon. Their actions were, again, this same contrast of what they could accomplish with their own works, with their own physical hands and might, versus what God could do and what God promised He would do. These sailors in Jonah are not acting on faith. They're acting simply on a lack of faith. Verse 5 goes on. Where is Jonah? The last part of verse 5 says, but Jonah was gone down into the sides of the ship, and he lay and was fast asleep. This guy, there's a storm out there. These sailors are panicking. They're scared to death. They're crying out to God. They're throwing stuff overboard. He's down in the bottom sleeping. Very interesting words here. Another contrast. Those who say, I can save myself with my human efforts, my human hands, my human ability, and Jonah. I think he knew he couldn't save himself. He did know he was out of favor with the Lord. He was in rebellion. He was running from the Lord. Somehow he's able to sleep. He goes down into the recesses of the ship. The furthest place, once again, I mentioned this a couple of times before, but Jonah thinks that he can get away from God by going down and going down and going down. Well, once you get on a ship, there's only so far you can go down. So he's in the lowest place he could possibly go, thinking I can get away from God if I keep going down, 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 down. And somehow he falls asleep. Now the word that's translated ship, the word in the original Hebrew text, it's interesting because it's a different word this time. It's not the same word that was just used previously. I mean, we're only on the 5th verse of Jonah, and we're already on the 2nd word for ship. It's been one same word before now, but now all of a sudden it's a different word in this verse. And this is the only time this word is used in all of the Bible. It comes from a Hebrew word which describes something that is covered or something that has paneling on it. Well, if you know much about the Bible, the word cover and covering is very important. It comes up a lot. Noah's Ark had to be covered. If you remember the pitch, God instructed Jonah to cover the entire outside with pitch. And there's a lot of depth and meaning in that word cover. This word ship, used this one time in all of the Bible, means covered. But when you look at the root, where the word comes from, it's not just that something's covered, but it's covered for a reason, to hide. So that's where this word is different than the pitch, the covering in the story of Noah. This word is talking about the idea of covering something specifically for the purpose of hiding what's underneath. So this, just imagine, of course, you don't have a house to hide in, but you might. But if you just imagine the shingles on your roof, that's the covering over your house. So you might say that what we're being taught here in this verse is that he has gone down into the lowest part of the vessel so that he would be covered, so that he would be hidden by the covering. He's hiding from God. Well, you can't do that. We know you can't. But somehow or other, he felt as though he was safe enough to go to sleep. It's pretty amazing, actually. Well, he's living up to the dual meaning of his name. He has been called upon by God to go and preach a message of repentance. In other words, give some people hope and peace. But instead, he's brought just the opposite of hope and peace to these sailors and anybody else on this ship. How in the world does he lay down and go to sleep? I just have no idea. Now, in the original Hebrew language, these words that are being translated here, lay and was fast asleep, this means he was out like a light. He's snoring. I mean, he is hard to sleep. The Hebrew word's only used 7 times in the Bible, and it means he is in a deep, deep sleep. This Hebrew word also sometimes can be used or be translated as stunned or maybe stupefied. So he's out of it. He's in a whole nother world. Again, a stark contrast to the men, the sailors that are scared to death, crying out, shrieking to their gods, throwing stuff overboard. He's down in the bottom. He's out of it. He's gone. He's sound asleep. He's snoring. Of course, they say that that's the best place on a ship, especially to get some sleep, at the very bottom, the very back. Supposedly it doesn't move quite as much. Look at Matthew 8:24, and I'm almost done. I've gone a little over here, I guess. Matthew 8:24, we just read this, but I'm going to read this again. Behold, there arose a great tempest in the sea, insomuch that the ship was covered with waves, but he was asleep. So Jesus can sleep because he knows who he is. He knows his role. He has no need to fear. How do you and I respond in life when things are terrible, when things are, out of sorts, when things are bad, when life is giving you grief and pain and sorrow? I think oftentimes we act like the sailors. Many oftentimes we attempt to use our own physical abilities, whether it's our own mental abilities, and I'm going to think my way through this, or I'm going to talk to some friends about it and get through this, or I'm going to put my hands on something and lift something and lighten my load. And too many oftentimes we act like those sailors. But if we would take the opposite lane, if we would take our eyes off of ourselves and our own abilities and fix our eyes on Jesus, who he is, not who I am, who he is, that he is King of Kings, Lord of Lords, on his throne, high and lifted up, and he has everything in control. And anything that he wants me to do, not only will he give me that guidance to help me understand he wants me to do whatever that thing is, but he'll enable me to do it. He'll give me the gifts, talents, and ability to do it. He will be the motivation. He'll be the motor. He'll be everything that's involved that's needed, except for just simply not being physical. That's my part. That's where I come in. He tells me what to do, when to do it, how to do it, guides me, gives me everything I need to do it, and then I just simply actually do it. But I'm keeping my eyes on him, and I'm not doing it to save myself because of who I am, reflecting on this misunderstanding that I can save myself. Okay, I've kind of gone on a little bit too long, but we'll stop there. Next time we'll jump into verse number 6. Let's bow and pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we just love you. We praise you. We thank you, dear Lord, for being this wonderful, powerful, awesome God. We thank you, dear Lord, for being our guide, for knowing perfectly who you are. Help us, dear Lord, to fix our eyes upon thee and not on me. Dear Lord, I pray for the many that are all around the world, lost, sick, dying, so many filled with grief and distress and sorrow, pain. Dear Lord, I just pray that you would remove all these illnesses, sicknesses. Dear Lord, I pray for a great and mighty move of your hand all across this planet, in every life, and every mind, and every heart. Dear Lord, I pray for all those that are working so very hard to serve you, missionaries all around the world. I pray for their lives, that you would just continue to work in them and through them to bring about your will in their lives and the lives of those around them. I pray, dear Lord, for all the world leaders, for presidents and whatever their titles are. Pray, dear Lord, for wisdom, that you would help them to make the right decisions as to how we're to move forward. Dear Lord, I pray for all those that are serving, and whether it's the military or police, law enforcement, or even first responders and firefighters and all those. I pray, dear Lord, that you would encourage them and give them strength and wisdom and help them to do their jobs well for your praise, honor, and for your glory. Dear Lord, I pray for the church. I pray for church leaders. I pray, dear Lord, for wisdom, that we would help to guide your church to move forward as you would see fit, whatever would be your will. Such strange times that we live in these days, dear Lord. Help us, guide us, direct us. Draw us unto you in the direction you'd have us go. Dear Lord, I pray for each and every church leader, every individual church, every church member. Dear Lord, I pray that we would be the light, the salt, shining brightly, being ever so attractive and leading people to the hope of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Help us, dear Lord, to be everything you want us to be. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.